Good evening, blessings to you all. Tonight is Tuesday night, so there's some questions have come in and we'll endeavour to answer them. So the first question, I've been married for 20 years, over 20 years, and my partner still won't tell me about how he helps his extended family and how he uses our money. What should I do? Well, entering into a relationship with someone, getting married, that's a big act of karma, isn't it? So, one thing we have to accept, once you enter into a relationship with the intention for it to be long-term, there's a lot of variables. People change. My experience observing the world, people change over time. Hopefully for the better, but not always. Their different experiences shape them in the family and work, health, the world around us. So it's quite a commitment to get married or enter into a relationship with somebody. The Buddha encouraged us to choose a partner who has similar kind of sila, similar level of moral conduct, similar outlook and attitude on these things, similar views on what is right or wrong, good or bad, similar value system maybe. That makes for a smoother relationship. Because we won't always see eye to eye with our partner, because we're different people. But if we can share relationship with similar views, so faith in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha would be a good, ideal starting point. But even then, it doesn't matter if you have some similar outlook, similar attitudes, not just similar interests or likes, like people say when they go on dating sites and all that kind of thing. But actually, what are the views of your partner? Really consider that when you're meeting, associating with someone. Otherwise, if you haven't considered this, then we can drift apart or end up in endless arguments and disagreements. And then, of course, we all have our original family, so we have to deal, in a relationship, we have to deal with the in-laws, brother-in-law, mother-in-law, father-in-law, sister-in-law, cousins, nephews, nieces, depending on how extended the family is. So it's a lot of responsibility and a lot of work involved in that to make it work, to live together and allow for those relationships takes quite a lot of effort. And that's why we say it's a commitment, because it requires a lot of effort. Physical effort maybe, mental effort. Monks sometimes talk about this. We say, we are single, so we live in the forest, we're single, we have our 5 khandhas. And that's already a lot to deal with, 5 things: body, feelings, memories and perceptions, thought formations and sense consciousness. That's lots already. You've got to deal with that, learn to be peaceful within your own 5 khandhas. You get married, then that's taking on another 5 khandhas, that's 10. So in a slightly facetious way you could say double trouble. Then you've got the in-laws, triple and quadruple trouble. And then if you have a few kids come along, I don't even know the words for quintuple, sextuple trouble. The number of khandhas just multiplies by 5, by 5, by 5. Maybe you end up with 100 khandhas swirling around you, all to be mindful of, to be seen as impermanent, not self, which is what we do in Vipassana, isn't it? A lot of work. So this is big karma, getting married, and people change. So ideally, the thing that shapes change in a good way is, say, maybe taking on the 5 precepts, listening to Dhamma, practicing mindfulness, practicing generosity, kindness, compassion regularly. That tends to change someone for the better, but that's not guaranteed. So unfortunately, sometimes people in their relationships, they do drift apart, or kind of gulfs open between them in their understanding or their level of trust, respect. And sometimes one will go in one direction, another in another, and it can get difficult as this person is experiencing lack of communication, maybe lack of sensitivity by one or both partners. And one thing you have to accept is that, because we are each individual, as we just chanted, we are the owners of our karma. So even if you love someone and build a relationship with them, and of course it can work, and many good things can happen, but you still are an individual being with your own karma. So if sometimes things get difficult or tricky, you're in a relationship and it's not working very well, or you've drifted apart, ultimately you have to come back to yourself and take responsibility for yourself, your own actions. And if you're following the Buddha's teachings, well, your aim is to be harmless, not to harm your partner, not to harm yourself, not to harm your kids, not to harm other people. And we use the 5 precepts as a guideline here, because if you use those as guidelines for knowing or making wise decisions and developing the values of, say, kindness, compassion, contentment, mindfulness in all your actions, your speech, and so on. Well, this tends to be the way we take responsibility for our actions, and this is how we practice in daily life, say in the family. Practicing mindfulness of our speech, our actions, taking responsibility for them, and pursuing the Dhamma path to the best of our ability. And if others in our family do that, all the better. Sometimes they follow us, or sometimes we follow them, and they're doing it already. But sometimes they don't. And if they don't, and they go in a different direction, you may have to accept that. You can forgive them, but you may have to come back and focus more on your own practice. Put all your efforts in there, or most of your efforts in there, because it's very difficult to change or influence someone else. Even your own partner may not listen to you. Your husband, your wife might not listen to you very much. They may have secrets, they may have their own agenda. So in the end you come back to your own practice. And if you're practicing what the Buddha taught to the best of your ability, sincerely, correctly, you won't be harming your partner, even if they're not interested or not supportive of what you're doing. They won't be harmed by your actions, because you'll be practicing the 5 precepts, practicing mindfulness, compassion, reflecting, considering your actions, paying attention to what you do, what you say. This will only be good for the people around you. But whether they understand or appreciate it or not, that depends on the person. And as I said at the beginning, people change. Sometimes we have to accept that. But, relationships are a learning process. They're your teacher. So sometimes we have to learn to forgive, learn tolerance, patience, learn to communicate better, understand each other better. and you do the best you can. But don't give up your own practice, because quite often that becomes your refuge. So all of this is advice from a single person about marriage. Your question, what should I do? Well, if all fails, become a nun. Shave your head and become a nun. Can't go wrong there. So another question, is it important to visit monasteries in person, or can we practice from home? Well, of course, especially at this time, during the last few years of COVID, this has become more of an issue, that sometimes you're prevented from visiting monasteries and you may have no choice but to be in lockdown or isolation, quarantine, whatever. But what we've found is, like this very live transmission now, is that, even if there is the obstacles of COVID, or you could be in a place where you're living in a very remote place where you can't travel to a monastery. Well, nowadays we're getting more and more technology to help us. At least we can visit the virtual monastery online. We can listen to Dhamma, read Dhamma, see monks, see nuns online. And that's the blessing side of technology. Technology has its curse side as well. It can be a curse in many ways, but it can also be a blessing. So, if you want to visit a monastery but you can't, well, second best is go online and then patiently wait for conditions to change. As far as, is it important to visit monasteries? Well, I'd say yes, because you see, one of the themes in the Buddhist teachings is to associate with the wise, associate with fellow practitioners, Sangha, teachers, seek out Kalyana Mitta. And the Buddha said this is all of the practice, having Kalyana Mitta, because good friends, wise friends, friends who will say the things that encourage us to practice, encourage us to give up defilements and pursue the path of developing the Eightfold Path and skillful qualities. They're very important, because sometimes our own mind is not telling us the right things. We need to see examples, and throughout the practice in the time of the Buddha to this modern day, Buddhist practitioners have gained from seeing the examples of others practicing. And although lay people can be well practiced and good examples, of course, you might find the area where the number of Kalyana Mitta is concentrated most in the world is a monastery. Or certainly also maybe a Buddhist center, meditation center can also be a good resource in your practice. But a monastery where people have practiced renunciation, they've been ordained, given up the lay life, they have a very refined level of sila, they're practicing mindfulness, they're investigating the Dhamma, developing wisdom, insight, and they serve the community, that's their life, and they're sincere in that, then those monasteries become amazing places where there's a store of knowledge, good vibes, good energy, that you can tap into when you visit, and you'll see and experience things on every level, the level of just seeing with your eyes, but also experiencing with your heart on a more subtle level, all kinds of things in a monastery that you won't experience elsewhere. And so I would suggest maybe your practice will be a little dry or even weak. The difference between weak tea and strong tea, weak coffee and strong coffee. You practice at home, you can, and sometimes we have no choice, of course. You might have work and family commitments, so you can't go to a monastery even if you want to sometimes. But the atmosphere, the environment, the people you're associating with, all kinds of factors and conditions are not as ideal as a monastery. So even if you can visit a monastery just briefly, offer dana, see some monastics, listen to Dhamma, discuss Dhamma, even if you don't engage in a Dhamma discussion, but you're just there, sort of absorbing some of the peaceful atmosphere, getting some of the good images that you see when you're in a monastery. If you can do that even briefly, it's such a powerful, good conditioning factor in your mind, in your life, that I would encourage you, to do it whenever you can. If you can't ordain, but you can still support Sangha, you can listen to Sangha, you can volunteer in monasteries or help out in different ways. There's plenty that you can do to engage, and I would say that's would become a valuable resource in your practice. It's not impossible to practice at home, of course, but when you're at home, you'll be surrounded by many kinds of people and neighbours, work colleagues and people in society. Many of them are not interested in the practice. And the danger of the lay life is it's much more bound up with sensuality, sensual desire, the accumulation of wealth, the seeking of pleasure of all kinds. And people are often more deluded, unfortunately, because of this. And so there's more coarser kinds of suffering around you, and there's more challenges to keep the practice of the Eightfold Path going in the home life. It's not so ideal as a monastery, so sometimes we need to uplift ourselves and go to a monastery, go to those places, and it can be such a valuable experience. Many people I know only visit monasteries very occasionally, but they really value it. It gives them important memories. They remember teachings that they got. Maybe they only go once every 6 months or a year or something, but the teaching they got on that day, often they remember for a long time. And how many conversations you have at home or at work do you remember for a long time? Probably the ones you remember most are the arguments, and they're not, you're remembering them for the wrong reasons. But you go to a monastery, you're often getting wisdom, guidance, encouragement to do more good, how to practice. And as a monk, you witness that, because sometimes people come back and tell you. They say, "Oh, do you remember 2 years ago when you gave that Dhamma talk and you said this?" And I heard that, and that really helped me solve my problem. And you're trying to rack your brains and think back 2 years and work out what on earth you said on that occasion. You might not remember the details, but if it helped them, all the better. That's good enough. Or me, myself, I can remember going to see monks 37 years ago. Say, like when I was a novice, I went on a few pilgrimages to see very wise, enlightened monks in Thailand. I can still remember some of the conversations. Something like asking, I think I mentioned this the other week, Lumpur Tate, asking Lumpur Tate, who's considered to be enlightened, does the Arahant think? If they do think, what do they think about? Which is the kind of question you ask when you're a novice monk. And getting an answer from an enlightened person. What did he say? He said, yes, the Arahant does think, but they choose when to think. They have that much mastery or self-control of their mind. They choose when to think, what to think. And if there's no need to think about anything, no one to teach, nothing much to organize or do, then they might just dwell in emptiness. I found that a really useful little reflection. Or other teachers, you go and see them, and they, in the forest tradition, they'd ask you something like, this is when I was a novice, they'd say, "Have you seen your bones yet?" And you go, gulp, oop. And then you think, oh yeah, they're talking about body contemplation, the first foundation of mindfulness. You practice to the point where you see the body in the body. Have you seen your bones yet? Have you done your practice yet? Or whatever they've said in answer to a question or just a comment or another teacher I went to see, his name was Luang Por Pian. When I bowed to him, I was thinking of Ajahn Chah, because Ajahn Chah was my teacher and Ajahn Chah was ill. So whenever I thought of Ajahn Chah at that time, I often thought of him in his state of illness. I was thinking of Ajahn Chah lying on his bed, because I used to attend to him and help him when he was lying on the bed because he was so ill. And as I was bowing to Luang Por Pian, I was just thinking of Ajahn Chah lying on the bed out of gratitude, coming into the robes, being a Buddhist monk. Luang Por Pian, who wasn't ill at all, he's just sitting there receiving a bow from a few of us monks. He just looked at me and said, yeah, I can sympathize when your teacher's ill lying on his bed. It's not the best, but you just have to make the best of the situation. Look after your teacher and follow his instructions. Whatever he said, whatever he instructed you to do, do it. Which was very nice instruction, and I still remember today, many, many years later. And I also remember the fact that he mentioned that Luang Por Chah was lying on a bed. And I think, how on earth did he know that? Because that's exactly what I was thinking in my mind. Or going to see Long Ta Mahabua. We went and saw him one year and we invited him to come to Melbourne. And he said, oh, you live in Melbourne, Australia, do you? He said, yes. He said, and who's your teacher? We said, Ajahn Chah is our teacher. I think he knew that anyway because I'd known him for a while by then. But anyway, he said it. He asked the question. And I said, Ajahn Chah is our teacher. He said, oh, Ajahn Chah is such a good monk. If you, wherever you go, whether it's Thailand or overseas, if you follow Ajahn Chah's teachings, you will progress in the Dhamma. Things will go well for you. So always make sure you follow Ajahn Chah's teachings. And then he gave a talk about the practice of mindfulness of the Buddha, Buddhanusati, recollection of Buddha. And I can still remember mostly what he said. That was about 20 years ago. So you go to a monastery, quite often you have experiences that you remember for life, or certainly for many years. Go other places, don't remember much at all, do you? 20, 30 years ago, the places you went, how much do you remember? Not much. So I'd recommend going to monasteries when you get the chance. Another question. When you live in the world, you need desire to work. And as you live your life, you have desire for pleasure, for entertainment, you have sexual desire come up all the time. So how do you practice with this? Well, whether you live in the world or you live in a monastery or if you're practicing the Dhamma, you still need desire. This is one thing that people sometimes misunderstand. They hear the word that craving, which is a form of desire, is the cause of suffering. This is what the Buddha identified as the cause of suffering. 3 types of craving: craving for sense pleasures, craving to become, and craving to not to become or to annihilate, to get rid of. And craving is the cause of suffering, craving is to be abandoned, craving is bad. Therefore I should have no craving, therefore I should have no desire in my mind. All desire is bad. But actually the Buddha made fine distinctions between what we call wholesome desire, skillful desire, and there's a few words for that, such as kusala chanda. Chanda means consent or desire. Kusala means wholesome. So wholesome desire, which is what motivates us and leads us to practice. And then unwholesome desire, which is often called craving. So desire, it can be good or bad. And of course, to meditate, practice the Dhamma, offer alms, practice charity, listen to Dhamma, do chanting, anything you do in terms of the path of practice leading to Nibbana requires motivation, desire. So a big part of our practice is learning to recognize craving and recognize wholesome desire, and then act accordingly. So craving is to be abandoned, wholesome desire is to be cultivated and developed. And they have different outcomes. And that's one way you recognize the kind of desire that is motivating you, is what are the outcomes. Craving always leads to some kind of suffering. Craving, or unskillful desire, literally the word danha means to be thirsty. Like on a hot day like today, very easy to feel thirsty, not enough water in your system. So you want water, you're thirsting after water or liquid. That's craving, but it's craving for so many different things. It's a mental quality that comes into our life, but it leads to suffering. Doesn't lead to peace, doesn't lead to wisdom, doesn't lead to contentment, doesn't lead to good things. It leads to more agitation, leads to more unhappiness, suffering, etc., etc. Wholesome desire, skillful desire, leads us to practice. Having seen that there is suffering, we want to find a way out of suffering. So we turn to practice to cultivate the Eightfold Noble Path, dana, sila, samadhi, panya. It leads us to put effort into our practice. So kusala chanda, skillful desire, often arises out of faith, hearing the Dhamma, meeting with a teacher, recognizing that there is stress, suffering in life and looking for a way out of it. These are wholesome desires, which you have to rely on until the end of the path is reached, Nibbana is reached. To get out every morning and meditate, say, if that's what you do, requires desire. You have to have desire to want to do it, be willing to do it. That's where the word consent, like chanda, means being willing to do something. Because you can only do it voluntarily. You can't force someone to Nibbana. They have to be willing to do it. So the skillful cultivation of desire in this way is part of the path, practice. We do need to look at that and separate between craving and then skillful desire. Say when you're meditating, you'll notice this. When you meditate, if craving slips into your meditation, you start wanting results. I want peace, I want to get rid of these thoughts, I want to be able to sit a long time with blissful state of mind, and that starts to agitate us. So as we meditate, we're separating out craving. And in the same way as if we have to go to work in this world, we have to earn a living as a layperson, you'll need desire to go to work, but you have to get it in context. You're working to earn a living so that you can feed yourself, clothe yourself, etc., and maybe a family as well. It's just a necessary part of existence, isn't it? And the way our culture, society works is you work, earn money, pay for things, and you can live. And you can live and practice the Dhamma as well. So as you work, you're also observing whether craving comes into your mind as you work, maybe craving for the rewards of your work. You want money or praise or good reputation or material rewards. And you have to be careful, because as you work, craving can take over. But it's also possible to work earn a living, look after a family, letting go of craving and developing wholesome desire at the same time. And that's the challenge of it. It's the challenge of practicing in the lay life. Maybe more kinds of desire are stimulated because there's more people and things and experiences around you in the lay life. So you have to work hard to keep focused on the Dhamma and develop a wholesome desire as you live your lay life. I mean, as we progress in the practice, we might decide to keep precepts, 5 precepts. So that already is streamlining your desire into a wholesome direction. So the Buddha wasn't saying human beings are born with and shouldn't have desire. Desire is a sin, desire is bad. He's just saying we will have accumulated desire and we accumulate more desire. And when I say desire, I mean craving here. We're born with craving and we accumulate craving through our life because we're not always mindful, we're not always fully insightful or wise towards the workings of our mind, so we do accumulate craving. But then at some point you might come along and say, but I'm going to commit to keeping the 5 precepts as guidelines to manage and minimize craving as I work, as I live in the world. So the Buddha said, human being, you'll have sexual desire, that you accept that. You're not saying sexual desire is evil and you shouldn't have it. You're saying keep the 5 precepts. So if you have a partner, well, just have the one partner. You may have greed for nice things and only limited funds and wealth at your disposal. So you may have a desire to get more wealth in a criminal way, say, but because you're keeping 5 precepts, you say, well, I know that would be wrong, that would lead to all kinds of unpleasant consequences, so I will just manage this desire by using precepts. And so I won't steal, I won't kill, I won't steal, commit acts of sexual misconduct, I won't lie, I won't drink or take intoxicants. In the beginning of our practice, that's what we work on, to manage craving, manage desire, limit it, reduce it. And then as you progress in the practice, where you use mindfulness and wisdom that you develop through meditation as well, listening to Dhamma, reflecting on Dhamma. So we have to just accept there will be craving in our mind as we practice, but you use the Dhamma practices such as precepts, mindfulness, patience, compassion, to work with craving, limit it, and find skillful ways to abandon it. And similarly, you have to arouse the positive, skillful desire. You listen to Dhamma, you reflect on Dhamma, and this motivates you to practice more. So everything has its cause. So craving has its cause, and we have to study and learn about that. Kusala chanda, or skillful desire, has its cause. We have to study that. So studying the mind, you really work out and learn what is wholesome and unwholesome, learn about karma, learn about what is the path to Nibbana and what is not the path to Nibbana. So it's a gradual learning process. Another question. When I'm hungry, I want to eat something, and I go and eat it. At this moment, this is a rebirth. I cannot understand why this is defined as a rebirth. Well, I think this is from the kind of practical explanation of karma and rebirth, and particularly the dependent origination process, how craving does arise through sense contact, and then with sense contact feeling arises, pleasant, neutral, unpleasant. And when we're not mindful and not reflective, that triggers craving of one sort or another, for or against, liking and disliking. And in some people's explanations of that round of dependent origination, one thing leading to another, They say, well, this is like a moment of rebirth or birth. You're born into that craving. So if you like something, like the food that you taste, you're born into the food. If you don't like it, you put something in your mouth and it's a surprise, it's a shock. Oh, I don't like that. Maybe you're born into aversion, ill will. Who made that? Or what did they put in that? Oh, what is this terrible food? It goes in a different direction, but it's still considered a form of rebirth. Because birth and death are literally one moment after another, moments of consciousness. You're born in this mental state, in this moment of consciousness, it arises, then it ceases, it dies. So one way of looking at the practice is life is made up of a chain of moments of consciousness. Birth and death is taking place at every moment. And this is why our mood and our experience can change so quickly, because the mind is so quick. You can be born into anger one moment, and someone says sorry, and the anger evaporates, perhaps. It starts when you're a kid. You see it with kids all the time, don't you? Like, sometimes kids come to the monastery and something goes wrong and they trip over, or something happens that annoys them and they're crying, born into suffering, and then mum gives them some sweets. Oh, that's good. All the crying and suffering disappears straight away. Happy face, born into happiness again. And that's going on for adults as well. It's just we hide it more, and maybe it's not so extreme or intense, but it can be. I mean, adults can also do that, can't they? One moment angry, one moment happy, one moment sad, one moment bored, one moment excited. You see that also, and in any age group. It's not a matter of age group really. It's just a matter of the mind being conditioned by things. You see something you like, oh, that's nice, you're born into that. You see something ugly or offensive, or you see someone you don't like, well, you become angry or afraid. You're seeing the birth and death of your mind states all the time. The word is aramana. Mental objects, sense objects, are giving rise to aramana at every moment. So pleasant, neutral, unpleasant, because aramana is also affected by feeling, the feeling that arises, the tone of the experience, pleasant, unpleasant. So it's one way people use to reflect on the practice, individual moments of birth and death. And so they say, like the lady, what was her name, Samawati, who perfected mindfulness, became enlightened, and unfortunately was killed in a fire, but before she died, she was perfectly mindful. So we get this phrase, one who is perfectly mindful never dies. The body may die through old age or accident, injury, but the mind doesn't die if it's perfectly mindful. The arahant who's attained nibbana never dies. They've attained the deathless. Because the mind is perfectly mindful and perfectly pure, there's no sense of self arising or passing away. Whereas the unenlightened person, this sense of self is constantly being conditioned, coming up. Even, refined, pleasant sense of self when you're meditating is still a sense of self. Birth and death is still occurring as long as there are gaps in our mindfulness and our wisdom. Birth and death continues. It's only the arahant who birth and death finishes. So it's a way of reflecting. If there's mindfulness, the mind doesn't die. When we lose our mindfulness, it's as if we're dead already, even though physically we're alive. And as the more you practice, the more you notice this. Oh, I just died. We even say it, don't we? Somebody's sort of sitting there and they have a glazed look, maybe they're just daydreaming or becoming drowsy, and you look at them, it's like they're dead already, isn't it? They're dead to the world. And they say, oh, she just died. But then they come back again, they're born again. But there's so many ways birth and death are experienced in the mind from moment to moment. And the more you practice, the more you become aware of this. So it's one way of talking about the practice. The word rebirth is more of a kind of modern description, I think. Really, in the time of the Buddha, they just had birth and death, birth again. So we just say jati, jata, jati, marana. It's talking about moments of consciousness. So you're born and die, born and die, born and die. But rebirth can be a useful way of looking at it, because that's giving you a sense of the weariness of seeing this endless process of birth and death, always, because of craving, always seeking something to satisfy yourself, to be happy again. It's very tiring, isn't it? All that searching and seeking for more pleasure, more contentment. So the arahant is weary of that. They experience what we call nibbida, and they lose interest in seeking out different experiences and kinds of pleasure and gratification in the world, because they know it doesn't last. So they're not fooled again. Don't get fooled again. The arahant doesn't get fooled again, so they don't get born again. We're still fooled by the world. We're still fooled by the glitter. We're seeking something a little better all the time. So you hear this. Even Buddhists will say it. They say, "Oh yeah, I've been sucked into the consumer mentality so many times. That's it. Done this life. I don't want to be born ever again, and I don't want to have to buy anything else. Fashion, no. All these pleasures of the world, no. I don't need a new phone, a new car." And they're really strong and determined. They're just fed up with everything and fed up with their craving, which is great. It may be a moment of wisdom and insight. And then, the next day it's, but maybe there's a new phone out. I'll just get that new phone. And off the whole process starts again. That's birth again, isn't it? It keeps happening. Last question. What is the difference between Guyama and Wyria? In essence, they're the same thing, meaning the essence, meaning the central core factor mental factor of Guyama is Wyria. Wyria means like energy or effort, persistent effort. It's one of the 5 faculties. It comes up all the way through the Buddhist teachings, because there's no way around it. If you're going to practice what the Buddha taught, you need to summon up and continue to summon up effort. Guyama is usually heard most often with Samma Guyama. It's one of the 6th factor of the Eightfold Noble Path, and it's called right effort. Right meaning it's combined with right view, right, with insight, with wisdom, and it's for the end of suffering. So it's the effort to cultivate the factors of the path for the end of suffering. And there's 4 right efforts. Samma Guyama is broken down into the effort to prevent unskillful states of mind from arising, that haven't arisen yet, prevent them from arising. Or if they have arisen, the effort to abandon them. And then the 3rd, Samma Guyama, is the effort to bring up, cultivate, bring up skillful, wholesome states of mind. And the last is to develop further, maintain and develop and preserve those skillful states that have arisen. So Samma Guyama is divided into those 4 areas. But the heart of Samma Guyama is Wyria. They're right there together. But this is one of the beauty of studying Buddhism, the suttas, the Vinaya, the Pali, the Abhidhamma. There's lots of links, and there's lots of ways the Buddha would look at the same thing from different angles, or look at the relationships between different mental qualities, both positive and negative, as ways to help us analyze and understand our experience better. So he lifts up similes and analogies and comparisons, and looking at things, how things work together. So a phrase that you hear a lot in the practice of meditation and developing samadhi is sati, sampajanya, and atapi. to develop samadhi, you need these three qualities: mindfulness, clear comprehension, and atapi is often translated as ardency. But again, it's really another aspect of Wyria, persistent effort. And this is why we sometimes feel mentally a bit tired when we're battling with our mind in meditation, because it requires effort. And in one meditation session you might drift off or lose your effort and become caught up into distraction. And you see, it requires a lot of effort to train this mind. And the ones who have done it get the rewards. And they master their mind, they manage to gain samadhi, overcome the hindrances, and then they can practice vipassana and have clarity and vision into the impermanent nature of phenomena, and they can free all their delusions. And that requires a lot of Wyria, effort. But in terms of the path, sometimes we describe it as samma vayama. Same thing, really. So, those are tonight's questions. We wish you well on this night. Tomorrow is Magha Puja, so it's a very important Buddhist festival day we call Sangha Day. It's a day to contemplate, remember the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. We chanted tonight the Awada Patimokkha, so if you want to know what the Buddha taught on that occasion, go back and look at those few verses. They're very useful for reflections in your practice, your daily practice. But for tonight, we'll leave it there.